Hello, everyone. Are we ready? Brilliant. Hi, everyone. My name is Nathan Lawson, and I'm the president of the Oxford Climate Society. And I'm a geography student at the University of Oxford, specialising in human and environmental geography, with a particular focus on environmental justice. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. I hope you're safe and well. Today is an incredibly special event for a number of reasons. First, we're collaborating with ICIS Magazine Oxford to present our first multilingual event on extraction education. So to quickly just say a little bit about Oxford Climate Society and the ICIS Magazine. So Oxford Climate Society is part of Oxford University, aiming to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaking events, we run educational programs throughout the year, including our award-winning School of Climate Change, which is now teaching over 1,500 people from across the world in this term's online school. We also run the world's largest student climate journal called Anthroposphere, and we're currently working with the university to develop net zero policies and to incorporate climate into the Oxford curriculums. A little bit on the ICIS magazine. So the ICIS magazine is the UK's longest running student magazine, publishing a termly collection of poetry, prose and visual art. They also host weekly events ranging from showcasing and the latest student poetry, talent to expert panels on topics such as the climate crisis and decolonisation. To introduce the topic of today's event in more depth, I'm going to hand over to my friend and colleague Malvika Gupta, who's a doctoral student at the Oxford Department of International Development, whose research focuses on the issues of extraction education in a range of geographies from India to South America. So without further ado, Malvika, I'll hand over you to introduce today's event.
Thanks, Nathan. Can you hear me just to check before I
Yep,
start?
I can hear you up.
Thanks. So, hi everybody. As Nathan said, that the topic of this event comes out of my research on the issue of indigenous education in India and Ecuador. I've been looking at the indigenous education in India in the frame of assimilation in terms of understanding how there's been a policy of assimilation which has been in place. The actors have changed, starting from missionaries to Hindu nationalist groups to the national government itself. And the latest kind of entrant in this story of assimilation are extractive industries. However, their involvement in provision of education for indigenous children has not been critically discussed much yet. We all know that extractivism in many parts of the global south, and certainly in India, has led to large scale displacement of indigenous peoples, their dispossession from land, criminalization of those resisting it, often falsely accusing them of being Maoists in the Indian case. Ecuador has equally witnessed criminalization of the indigenous movement, especially under the government of Rafael Correa from 2007 to 2017. And it witnessed unprecedented destruction of the environment as a result of oil extraction and large scale mining projects. Extractivism is then an economic ideology practiced by the state, private companies, and through the execution of public private partnership projects. Now, to understand the role played by extractive industries in indigenous education, I find the concept of extraction education very useful. I borrow this from Judith Walker, an academic at UBC in Canada, who writes about alignment of education policy in British Columbia with the interests of the liquefied natural gas industry in BC. She might be here with us today, and I would invite her to share her thoughts with us if she has joined. I find this concept very helpful in making sense of the reality in the central states of India and the Ecuadorian Amazon, my two fieldwork sites in the DPhil. We see extraction of not just natural resources from the ground, but extraction of children from their communities, land, forests, and consequently from their knowledge systems and ways of life. Extraction education takes place in the form of corporate social responsibility projects of both uh, state run and private extractive industries through public private partnerships between the state and private companies, or directly by the state itself, which creates a discourse and institutionality for accelerating mining in order to fund social development programs such as education. In the garb of this largesse, these projects further remove children from their knowledge systems, leading not just to conquest of their land and resources, but conquest of minds. They regularly speak of indigenous peoples in colonial terms as poor, backward, and primitive, who, whom they seek to develop through this education. One such large school in India, which one of our speakers would probably talk about, aims to convert tax consumers into taxpayers. This phenomena is usually accompanied by closure of small scale village schools and crowding of children into large scale centralized schools far away from the communities, which could be both residential or non residential. Now, in the name of post extractivism and socialism of the 21st century, we saw the emergence of Ecuador as an extractivist state under the presidency of Rafael Correa. He established Ciudades del Milenio, Millennium Cities, and Escuelas del Milenio, Millennium Schools, while systematically destroying the small scale model of the intercultural bilingual education system, which was built in the 1980s after a hard won struggle of the indigenous movement in Ecuador. Correa's discourse on expansion of large-scale mining in order to expand education using mining royalties was paradoxical given the constitutional process that he oversaw, which made Ecuador a plurinational and intercultural state and the first to recognize rights of nature. I think we need to link indigenous struggles of sovereignty over their land, forest, along with struggles of knowledge and epistemologies more urgently than ever if we are to challenge the epistemicide which goes on hand in hand with ecocide. Finally, I think it's important that we recognize the challenges of extraction education in the global south are not far removed from what's happening at the elite institutions such as the universities that we are all a part of. We are directly implicated in this in many ways. Divestment from fossil fuels campaign is an inspiring example of this struggle. There have been several moves towards epistemic decolonization. We need to take steps towards decolonizing our curriculum and institutions, not just by peppering the curriculum with writings of people with color or just having university members from diverse backgrounds, but we need to seriously rethink the very epistemological architecture of our universities and consider incorporation of indigenous forms of knowledge. Finally, we need to move away from extractive methodologies and find ways of framing research in collaborative ways and pursue projects which allow a genuine co-production of knowledge with research participants as collaborators rather than as informants. I think it's time that we take seriously what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls epistemologies of the South and learn from them. Chomsky, who I think is the next speaker at the OCS forum next week, reminds us that if we have any hope of survival, we have to learn from the indigenous peoples. And today we have the honor of having an exceptional panel of three inspiring indigenous women thinkers, writers, and activists whose resistance as well as creative work against all odds has a lot to teach us. So then, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers and invite them to speak. Our first speaker will be Sony Sori, who's a Koya Adivasi school teacher turned people's leader from Sameli village of Dantewada district in South Bastar, Chhattisgarh in India. She was arrested by the Delhi police's crime branch for Chhattisgarh police in 2011 on false and fabricated charges of acting as a conduit for Maoists. During her imprisonment, she was mentally tortured and sexually assaulted by Chhattisgarh State Police. She was acquitted in 6 of the 8 cases filed against her due to lack of evidence. By April 2013, the Indian courts had acquitted her in 6 of the 8 cases filed against her. After release from prison, Soni began campaigning for the rights of those caught up in the conflict between Maoist insurgents and the government, in particular, those criticizing police violence against Adivasis or the indigenous peoples in India. In 2018, Soni won the Frontline Defenders Award. She's a fearless activist, and despite the continued harassment by the state, she has stood her ground to fight for the rights of her community. She's currently at the front line of the Adivasi people's resistance against the mining of the sacred Nantraj Hills in Dantewada, which is seen as Koya people's supreme deity. Then our second speaker is Ruby Hembrom, who's a Santhal Adivasi cultural documentarian and practitioner based in Kolkata. She's the founder and director of Adivani, First Voices, an archiving and publishing house of and run by Adivasis, started in July 2012. She is the writer of Adivani's Santhal Creation Stories for Children, a recast of the Santhal creation myths in English, and the prize-winning Disai Bon Hul on the Santhal Rebellion of 1855-57. She has recently been actively involved in the campaign against the hosting of the World Anthropology Congress by the world's largest boarding school for indigenous children in India, Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences, which was due to be held in 2023. This campaign succeeded in the withdrawal of International Union of Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences collaboration with this institution. Finally, our third speaker is Kátya Matsua, who is from the Amazonian Quechua Nation, community of Chamato, Pastaza province of Ecuador. I met Kátya for the first time in 2019 at the Piatua Libre protest against a hydroelectric project on the river Piatua in the Ecuadorian Amazon. She led the women's section of the Ecuadorian National Indigenous Movement, CONAIE, Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities, from 2014 to 2017. During her presidency, she created a campaign, Resistir es mi derecho, led by the indigenous women for the defense of human rights and collective rights to their territories at national and international levels. In addition to this, she actively defends intercultural and bilingual schooling and fights for a fair access to higher education for all peoples and nations of Ecuador. She has a master's degree in Latin American Studies from the Universidad Andina Simón Bolívar, and is currently working on a research project of the Centro de Derechos Económicos y Sociales in Ecuador. She's passionate about her work on the role of indigenous women in constructing a plurinational and intercultural democracy. So I'd like to now invite our first speaker, Sony Sori, to address us. Sony, over to you.
सब साथियों को जोहार। मतलब जो छत्तीसगढ़ बस्तर में जो हालत हो रही है आदिवासियों को लेके, और मैं एक टीचर रह चुकी हूँ, तो मुझे लगता है कि शिक्षा बहुत बड़ी चीज है, और शिक्षा में जितनी ज्यादा ताकत है वो शायद किसी में नहीं है, और शिक्षा में बहुत बड़ी ताकत होती भी है। और मैं टीचर ना होती और मैं इतनी अच्छी शिक्षा ना ली होती तो शायद मैं आज इस जगह पे नहीं होती। लेकिन आज की शिक्षा और हम जो ने लिया था उस शिक्षा में, दोनों में बहुत फर्क है। और वो ये फर्क है क्योंकि आज की जो शिक्षा है, जो मानसिक रूप से हमारे जो मतलब पढ़ने वाले बच्चों के साथ एक गुलामी की तरह एक जिंदगी जीने के लिए मजबूर किया जा रहा है। और वो इसलिए क्योंकि अभी जो सरकार और कंपनी दोनों मिलके जो स्कूलों को चला रहे हैं, तो सिर्फ अपने फायदे के लिए चला रहे हैं, ना उनके हक अधिकार के लिए, और उनको कैसे लड़ना है, कैसे जीना है, किस तरह से शिक्षा से उनको मजबूत दिलाना, ये शिक्षा आज नहीं है। जो मैं समझती हूँ ऐसे कि कितना मतलब ये चीज होनी चाहिए, वो नहीं है। तो इसलिए जो कंपनियां हैं, जैसे अडानी को ले लीजिए, जिंदल को लीजिए, और आरती स्पंज, एसआर, एनएमडीसी, ये सारी कंपनियां मतलब हमारे बस्तर में अब है। मतलब जैसे एनएमडीसी का, अब एनएमडीसी क्या करती है, सरकार को पैसे देती है, और सरकार और ये एनएमडीसी जो दोनों मिलके स्कूल चलाने की बात से दूर होने की जैसे शिक्षा उनको दिया जाता है। उनको हर चीजों से अलग रख के वो शिक्षा दी जाती है, उनके एक तरफ से गुलामी। क्योंकि कंपनियों के जो कंपनी जो देती है पैसे, तो सरकार तो कंपनियों के ही गुलाम है। तो हमारे जो बच्चे जो पढ़ रहे हैं, जिनको शिक्षा दी जाती है, वो तो गुलाम होंगे ही। और ऐसे ऐसे चीजें देखने को मिल जाता है कि मतलब वो हमेशा, जैसा एनएमडीसी ने माइनिंग के हमारे खदानों को खोद रहे हैं, खोद के बाहर ले जाके वो पैसे हमारे बच्चों को दे के ये बताते हैं कि हम पैसा दे रहे हैं, हम सब कुछ आपके लिए कर रहे हैं। लेकिन नहीं, वो माइनिंग खोदते हुए भी वो जब उसके लाल पानी उसके नीचे जब बह जाती है, तो वो पेट में जो बच्चा रहता, वो बच्चा भी उस लाल पानी को पी के एक मानसिक रूप से वो ग्रस्त हो जाता है, उसे कोई दिमाग का सही नहीं रहता। वो सबको छुपाने के लिए वो उस तरह की शिक्षा के लिए मतलब पैसे दे के ये बताने की कोशिश करता है। तो माइनस से हमारे पूरे मतलब बस्तर के जो बच्चे पढ़ रहे हैं और शिक्षा ले रहे हैं, तो ये पूरी तरह से नष्ट है, मतलब खत्म है। तो इस तरह से चीजें हैं। और आदिवासी की जो पहचान है, आदिवासी की पहचान को कैसे कंपनी आने से खत्म हो रही है, ये बहुत बड़ी चीज है। क्योंकि कंपनी के स्कूलों में या फिर सरकार के स्कूलों में, दोनों में एक दूसरे का आदान प्रदान है, और ये लोग ये सिखाते हैं। और जैसे कि हमारी जो पहचान है हमारे रहन सहन से, हमारे डाइट से, हमारे कल्चर से, हमारी संस्कृति से, तो वो नहीं है। उसमें ये सिखाया जाता है कि आपको कौन सी देवी को मानना है, कि कैसे चीजों को मानना है। वो जैसे राम की बात हो, दिवाली हो या होली है, इस तरह के त्योहारों का उसका, और उसकी भगवानों को, दुर्गा को मानो, ये गणेश जी को मानो, ये हमारी शिक्षा में दिया जा रहा है। तो वो हमारे बच्चों को जो जन्म से जिस देवी के हैं उसको नहीं बताया जाता। हमारे जंगल जंगल जमीन के बारे में भी नहीं बताया जाता। हमारे जो खान पान उसके बारे में नहीं बताया जाता। हर चीज का इनको ने विरोध, मतलब एक तरफ से देखा जाए आम आदिवासियों को अपने ही कल्चर, अपनी पहचान से पूरे खत्म किया जा रहा है। तब होगी जब कि मान के चलो हमारे त्योहार होते हैं तो छुट्टी देना चाहिए। जब मतलब अगर सरकारी स्कूल हो चाहे प्राइवेट स्कूल हो, चाहे हमारी त्योहारों में छुट्टी नहीं दी जाती है, लेकिन जैसे दिवाली होती है तो हिंदुत्ववादी का उनको छुट्टियां दिया जाता है। तो आप ये बताइए कि हमारे बच्चे जब वो छुट्टियां ही नहीं देती हैं, वो जब त्योहारों में, चाहे उनकी कोई भी कार्यक्रम में, कोई भी ऐसे कल्चर के कुछ भी होता है, तो वो छुट्टियां नहीं देंगे तो फिर वो सीखेंगे कैसे? वो कैसे जानेंगे कि हम किसको मानते थे, हमारा देवी कौन है, हमारा रहन सहन कैसा? ये नहीं मानते। मतलब पूरी तरह शिक्षा से, तो इस तरह से शिक्षा दे दे के हमारे लोगों को दूर किया जाता, हमारे बच्चों को इतना दूर किया जा रहा है। और सरकार की भूमिका क्या, ये बात होती है ना कि सरकार क्या कर रहा है इनके लिए। सरकार कंपनी से मिलके वो एक दूसरे से मतलब वो सौदा करके हमारे बच्चों की शिक्षाओं को पूरा खत्म कर रहे हैं। हम चाहते हैं कि अगर शिक्षा देनी है तो वो शिक्षा दिया जाना चाहिए। जैसे हम आदिवासी आप कहने लग गए हैं, हमारे पूरे बस्तर के लोग कह रहे हैं कि हमको वो शिक्षा दिया जाए जो जो हम चाहते हैं, जो हमारे परंपरा चलते आया है, उस हिसाब की शिक्षा होनी चाहिए। गांव में एक स्वतंत्रता का शिक्षा होना, किसी की गुलामी की नहीं। वो जान सके कि हक अधिकार की लड़ाई कैसे लड़नी है, हमको जंगलों को कैसे बचाना, हमारा देवी देवताओं को कैसे बचाना, और हर चीज की इस तरह की शिक्षा हो। अगर ये शिक्षा अगर हम में नहीं होती तो इतनी शोषण, इतना कुछ अत्याचार होने के बाद भी हमने जो आवाज उठाया, वो तो शिक्षा का सबसे बड़ा महत्वता था। लेकिन हमको ऐसा शिक्षा दी गई थी कि हम एक आदिवासी हैं, जंगलों में रहते हैं, और कैसे हमारी खेती करनी चाहिए, कैसे मुल्क को खाना चाहिए, कैसे जंगलों के अंदर में घूम के अपना व्यवस्था करना चाहिए। हर चीज की हमको उस तरह से उस समय हमने पढ़ा, हमारे पिताओं ने, हमारे माताओं ने सिखा। तो हम भी चाहते हैं कि हमारा बच्चा नौकरी करने के लिए शिक्षा नहीं ले, बल्कि अपने हक अधिकार को जानने के लिए वो शिक्षा दिया जाए। वो शिक्षा तभी संभव है जब हमारे ही गांव में, जैसे ग्राम सभा, कोई भी काम करने के लिए ग्राम सभा होती है, तो उसी तरह से हमारे बच्चों की शिक्षा के लिए शुरुआत, मतलब फर्स्ट प्राथमिकता से, मतलब उनको सीधा सीधा उनको उसी गांव में स्कूल होनी चाहिए। और गांव में जब जाए स्कूल होगा, वहां पर शिक्षा लेंगे तो बच्चे अपने कल्चर से दूर नहीं होंगे, अपनी संस्कृति से दूर नहीं होंगे, अपने माता पिता से दूर नहीं होंगे, अपना किसी से मतलब दूर नहीं होंगे। एक एक मतलब एक दूसरे का एक प्रेम रहेगा आपसी में। लेकिन अब ऐसा नहीं है ना। अब तो ऐसा पोटा केबिन के नाम से मतलब इतनी दूर में शहरों में स्कूलों को लाया गया है, पूरे गांव के स्कूल को तोड़ दिया गया, सब कुछ मतलब बिखर दिया गया है। और कहते हैं कि आदिवासी तो बहुत सीधे होते हैं, आदिवासियों को तो हम बहुत शिक्षित कर रहे हैं। नहीं, आदिवासी ऑलरेडी ज्ञानदाता है, उनके पास दिमाग है, बुद्धि है, सब कुछ है, सब तरह का ज्ञान है। पर उस ज्ञान को दोबारा शिक्षा में लाके उसको और बेहतर बनाना चाहिए। वो तभी बन सकता है जब हम अपने गांव के बच्चों को अपने गांव में ही स्कूल लगा के उसको पढ़ाया जाए, उसको बताया जाए ये सारी चीजें। लेकिन सरकार की योजना से और कंपनियों के बीच में हमारे जो मतलब शिक्षा के नाम पे जो चीज हो रही है, सबसे बड़ा हिंसात्मक टाइप की शिक्षा दी जाती है। ये शिक्षा तो एक बंदूक की लड़ाई से भी ज्यादा खतरनाक मुझे लगने लग गई। वो इसलिए क्योंकि अगर एक नर्स, मतलब जैसे एनएमडीसी ने पैसे देते हैं तो एक मतलब नर्स बन के आते हैं, उनको ये बताया जाता है कि एनएमडीसी के पैसे से तुमको नर्स के ट्रेनिंग दिया जा रहा है, एनएमडीसी के पैसे से एग्रीकल्चर की पढ़ाई किया जा रहा है, एनएमडीसी के पैसे से तुमको इस स्कूल में पढ़ाया जा रहा है। तो वो जो बच्चा पुलिस बनता है वो किसको मारता है? उसको यही दिया जाता है कि हमने तो पैसे दिए, हमने तुमको पढ़ाया, बंदूक भी दिया, तो आप किसको क्या करोगे? आप कानून के रखवाले हो। उनको कानून के रखवाले नहीं बनते। जब जंगल में जाते हैं तो हम जैसे आदिवासी को, हमारे निर्दोष आदिवासी को हमारे ही लोग उनको जाके मार रहे हैं। तो ये कैसी शिक्षा है बताइए? और जैसे एग्रीकल्चर की बात होती है तो हमारे अपनों की जमीन में वो बच्चा जाके वो ये बताता है जब कर्मचारी बन के कि इस जमीन में आप ये खाद नहीं डालेंगे डालेंगे, जो प्राकृतिक से बन के जो खाद आते उसको नहीं डालेंगे, एक आप ऐसे रासायनिक खाद डालेंगे इसमें डबल फसल होगी, इस तरह का बताते हैं। तो ये कैसे शिक्षा है, ये तो पूरा वो जमीन तो बर्बाद हो जाएगी, तो उससे क्या रह जाएगा। तो मेरा कहने का है ऐसे शिक्षा देने का क्या मतलब है कि हमारा मतलब जो शिक्षा दिया जाता है, हमारा बच्चा बंदूक पकड़ अपनों को मार रहा है, अपनी जल जंगल जमीन को बेदखल मतलब इस तरह से करके कर रहा है, और अस्पतालों में आते हैं तो नर्स जैसे बन जाते हैं, डॉक्टर भी बन रहे हैं, नर्स भी बन रहे हैं, उस जगह पे अगर नक्सल के नाम से अगर मार दिया जाता है गांव में, उसको हम लोग डेड बॉडी को लेके आते हैं इसके पोस्टमार्टम के लिए, जबकि वो जानते हैं पोस्टमार्टम में ये चीजें गलत है, इसकी रिपोर्ट बनाओ, तो बोलते हम नहीं बना सकते। क्यों, किस लिए नहीं बना। अगर ऐसा सच्चाई की बात क्यों हम लिखेंगे और बनाएंगे ना, तो हमको नौकरियों से बेदखल किया जाएगा। इसलिए हमने एनएमडीसी और अडानी जैसे ऐसे कंपनी को पैसों से पढ़े हैं, इसलिए हम लोग इस चीजों का उसमें कुछ भी मदद नहीं कर सकते। तो ये शिक्षा किस काम की। शिक्षा वो हो जाए, गलत हो या सही हो, लेकिन सच्चाई के लिए हमेशा वो अड़े रहे और कभी ना झुके, वो कितनी भी परिस्थिति क्यों ना है, लेकिन सच्चाई के साथ रहना चाहिए। लेकिन ऐसा नहीं है, तो वो शिक्षा हम चाहते हैं। ये शिक्षा तो सिर्फ एक गुलाम बना के हमारे बच्चों को और ऐसे शिक्षा दे के हमारे पूरी जल जंगल जमीन, हमारी देवी देवता, हमारी परंपरा, सारे चीजों को नष्ट करने वाली शिक्षा दिया गया, जिससे आज हमारे पूरे मतलब कहना चाहिए हमारे आदिवासी के युवा पीढ़ी सब खतरे में है। और ये देखा जाए तो पूरे देश में आदिवासी के अलावा भी और भी जो स्कूलों की बात कर रहे हैं वो भी खतरे में है, मुझे जो लगता है। और मैं तो यही चाहूंगी कि शिक्षा हो तो एक ऐसी शिक्षा जो आत्मनिर्भर हो सके, हक से लड़ सके। ऐसे मेरे पास कई बच्चे हैं, अभी भी जिस लड़ाई पे मैं चल रही हूँ उसमें ऐसे अनाथ बच्चे बहुत हैं, और उन बच्चों को हम तो यही सिखाते हैं। उन बच्चों के माता पिता नहीं हैं, लेकिन फिर भी मैं एक टीचर रह चुकी हूँ, अब नहीं हूँ, मुझे तो इतनी प्रताड़ित के बाद मुझे बाहर निकाला गया, लेकिन आज भी मेरे पास बच्चे हैं, और वो बच्चे अपने आत्मनिर्भर पर जिएंगे और रहेंगे। तो शिक्षा वो होनी चाहिए, शिक्षा ऐसे नहीं होना चाहिए कि हम किसी का गुलामी कर सके, नहीं, हमको कोई गुलामी नहीं करना है। अगर हमारी शिक्षा अच्छी रहेगी और शिक्षा को हम जितना मजबूती से एक ईमानदार मतलब एक स्वतंत्र रूप से लेंगे, तो हम हर तरह से लड़के अपने देश को भी बचाएंगे। और इसलिए आज के युवाओं को वो शिक्षा देना बहुत जरूरी है।
So do I do the translation? What Sony just said, Sony just talked about the three main points. One is the how extraction educations. She started with saying that as a teacher herself, what she learned from her elders and the and her community people, she wishes that the same kind of education she could give as a teacher to other Adivasi children in her area. So she started with saying that the current form of education in which the corporations, mining, especially the mining corporations, are funding education, the extraction education companies today are the major funders of Adivasi education, next only to the government. Earlier, the government was promoting public-private partnership in education, but of late, the government has completely handed over the system of education in Adivasi regions to mining, especially mining corporations. She gave examples of NMDC, Adani, Aarti Sponge, SR, as Jindal, as companies which have started now investing in education in her region, where they are fighting on multiple fronts against big dams, against iron and steel industries, against sponge iron factories. And that she says that how can these companies even fund tribal education when they don't even understand that our future is secure only when our forest, land, and language is kept alive. She then talks about indigenous education, where she says that basically there is no difference in attitude towards the Adivasi people, either in the government schools or in the corporate funded extractive education schools, where they consider Adivasis as primitive, underdeveloped, and these schools are completely not under the control of the government. There is absolutely no rules, regulations, within the government system to monitor what is happening in these schools. And she says that all these years, the government and the companies have not only tried to alienate us from our lands, forests, and rivers, but have also parallelly tried to displace us from our knowledge systems, which are linked to our lands, forests, and rivers. And she thinks this is a psychological war, which is far more dangerous than the military intense conflict that has been playing out in her region in Bastar. About the role of the state, she says that the state by design has been oppressive, and especially in the last few decades, they have been going out of their way to promote corporate interests, and therefore they have absolutely no respect for what by any means, whether it is the question of Adivasi people's rights to the land or their rights to the education. She ends with saying that they, as Adivasis themselves, and as a fighter of the Adivasi people herself, what they demand today, the Adivasi communities, is that education must be under their control, and that the village schools that were functioning in her region were deliberately closed down so that her her community's children would be forced to send their children to schools outside their region into these corporate funded extractive education schools. And therefore they demand that the government must withdraw, the corporates must withdraw from the education and hand over control of the education to the Adivasi communities themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Soni, and Sharanya for translating. Really important points there about the colonization of the mind that I'll touch on later in my questions, and also about the role of the state and private corporations as well. So thank you, Soni. We'll now pass on to our second speaker, Ruby.
Johar, everyone. So like Malvika set the stage saying that extraction education for Adivasis is actually an extension of the de-indigenizing learning agenda carried out as an empowerment model right from colonial times right up to now. But also you have to look at how India's nation building vision and the debates in the Constituent Assembly actually legitimize this kind of a policy. So on one side, you see the Adivasi leader, Jaipal Singh Munda, advocating for and defending the rights of Adivasis and their identity, and ensuring their authentic representation, not only in the constitution, but outside. But then you would also see that the mindsets, the general mindsets of the non-Adivasi members in the Constituent Assembly actually shows how racist they were right from the start. So some of the things that they said, I'll quickly quote. So the underlying conclusion was that Adivasis were peoples, I quote, still in such a subhuman state of existence for which we should be ashamed. Then the existence of the scheduled tribes in the scheduled areas are a stigma on the nation, who need to come up to the level of the rest of the population and develop so quickly that they may become indistinguishable from the rest of the Indian population. So this is really the premise on which the project of taming, refining, and humanizing Adivasis, which still continues in the form of formal education, was seen as a vehicle of deliverance. So like Sony Sori said, and Malvika, that this education as a development tool to assimilate and civilize has actually just proven to be a recolonizing process. A takeover of Adivasi beings by wiping out everything that makes them so, through this out of context, un-Adivasi education, and an insertion of mainstream alien values and lessons in, most importantly, how not only not to be yourself, but also how to hate yourself, your identity, and your culture. So extraction education joins this long line of paternalistic legacy of schooling of Adivasis, and now especially with the kinds of schools we see, especially the one in Bhubaneswar, Kalinga Institute of Social Sciences, KISS, So in the garb of world-class facilities and education, using capital, glitz, glamour, public relations to glorify that education that de-indigenizes Adivasi minds, they are getting government support. They have got UN support. And that is surprising because you look at the UN Indigenous Peoples Forum or the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights on one side, and then over here you see that other wings of the UN give schools like this the support. So here, what is happening is it's not just an ethical concern, but it's a sinister one where they actually set up schools in regions where they have extractive stake. So the link is very, very clear. So operating in places that continue to resist such displacement or extractive industries, or even in areas where they've been legally defeated, like in the 2013 Niamgiri case against Vedanta. So what happens in schools like the KISS? This is free education given. And they empty out children from the villages, packing them into the confines of school boundaries and mechanizations and mainstream them. So here you have children who stay in the system for 15 or 16 years. And young Adivasis imbibe and mimic a way of being and thinking that will support, endorse, and owe their allegiance to the ones who educated them, just like what Sony Sori was talking about. This is extraction education, churning out a generation of Adivasis alienated from their culture, language, and worldviews that will not look at land grab, environmental degradation, displacement in the same ways their ancestors did, and will not have the lived experience, neither the will nor the know-how and ability to resist. This is destabilizing current and future Adivasi movements and resistance by the conquest of education. So extraction education effectively disempowers Adivasi. And when you look at the other side of what is really being provided in these schools, you see that the mainstream education is one of substandard services. So not only do they live in these cramped places, unhygienic and all of that, but then they're given an education that is really of the poorest of poor standards. So here they come out with low literacy skills and they're unable to, get mainstream jobs that their schooling was set up to do. And how do I say this about a school like KISS? I mean, this is something we would say about the government schools. But when the opposition to them hosting the World Anthropology Congress happened, here there were some videos that were released by students speaking in favor of KISS. And of course, they came across, really looking up to their founder as somebody who's the savior, and it only was that. But then I looked at the languages the children were using. Of course, it was not their native languages that they were speaking in. It was mostly Oriya, and there was one video in English. And I heard this person communicate in this English, and I was just so upset. Forget about the propaganda, but I was just upset that they go to this schooling system that's supposed to be world-class, and they come out unable to even string 2 words in English. And I was like, this is how we are being cheated of everything. But why do you think they do this? They deliberately give us this shoddy education so that they can subjugate us further. Where do you think your labor class is going to come from? Where do you think your domestic help is going to come from if they actually get this quality education? But a lot of people are not really talking about the quality of this education, because KISS has this system of taking children when they're really young, about 5 or 6, and they don't release them into the real world until they've finished college and university. So when they take exception to being called a factory school, they should actually look at their educational system, because it really is a factory line. So from primary school, they go into the secondary, to the middle school, to higher education, and then they go on to college and university. And if KISS had its way, I mean, it's not an impossibility in the near future, if they had job centers these children would be again absorbed in that system. So they're never leaving KISS, let's say, forever. And how then are they supposed to, what would I say, gain this consciousness about who they are when they are so under the control of this KISS system? So here you see that the KISS website themselves does not tell us about who these children are, what they've been doing since they passed out from school. So there is this intellectual bias and intellectual alienation, and we understand that their education must be substandard, and the only test of it would probably be their employability. But really, when you look at KISS, they don't talk about their students at all. This is something they should be advertising, but no, that's not what you find on their website. What you do find is that they have these Guinness Book of World Records where they do these really absurd things, like the largest number of people brushing at one time. I mean, and then the largest number of people doing something, some yoga. So it's really peculiar what they take pride in. So why is their website not talking about these students? And they've been in the system for 28 years. Surely some of them should have been part of the KISS, let's say the board members, or part of the managerial systems, or even their teachers, but this information is not available. So what really is happening over there? So here you have a system which I fear later on. So not only the fear of how they justify extractivism, but also they would probably sell this as a success story where they say, look at these children, so many of them, generations of them coming out without having to use reservation, which means they are again going to destabilize another very important right of Adivasis. So which reservation is like your affirmative action. So there are possibilities. So I would say that the dangers of what extractive education can do are like enormous, and they are very, very scary. And then when you try to think of decolonizing this education, because this is a question a lot of people ask us, we think that you cannot decolonize an education without decolonizing the schooling system and the other educational systems. So can our knowledge systems thrive and be transmitted in establishments that are built, owned, and run by non-indigenous people and mindsets? Can our curriculum and experiences be recreated in classrooms? So even if we have our own curriculum, who are the teachers who are going to be teaching them? Because they will look at us and say, you don't have the adequate qualifications. So for us to actually enter these systems, we again have to be recolonized. Our teachers have to be recolonized. So is it really possible to bring in change within a system that is against us? Is it possible to become from non-thinking and unintelligent peoples that they call us into people who can transform education, not just for ourselves, but for everyone? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ruby. And very interesting last few questions there about, the very process of getting into the education system is in itself a colonial practice. Brilliant. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, so let's go on to our final speaker, Katie.
Thank you very much for this invitation to University de Oxford and Malvika. Realmente es muy importante, especial para mí, compartir con Sony y Ruby algunas ideas y con ustedes. Un saludo de la Tierra del Sol Recto, que es el Ecuador, un país muy bonito que espero que algún día lo visiten. Bueno, con esa introducción, quisiera decir que esta idea de la educación extractiva me parece muy interesante. Es algo que no lo he escuchado acá en mi medio y espero hacer una aproximación a esto desde mi entender. Pienso que en nuestro país este concepto tendría varios niveles, ¿sí? Que tendría que ver desde lo local hacia lo nacional. ¿Por qué? porque el Ecuador es un país cuya economía es primario exportadora y gran parte del presupuesto del Estado tiene que ver con la renta petrolera, ¿sí? Entonces, aquí creo que hay lo que decía, algunos niveles. Y bien, ahora he preparado para ustedes una presentación que espero que sea de utilidad. Entendiendo que el Ecuador tiene un buen porcentaje de su presupuesto de la renta petrolera, quisiera empezar con un contexto nacional y pensar con esta idea actual que estamos viviendo, que básicamente es un retroceso en la educación respecto a la pandemia. Y
Espera. ¿Podría traducir lo que ha dicho hasta ahora?
por favor, gracias.
Okay, so first of all, Katie has expressed her gratitude for the fact that she can be here today. And she sends her love from the Tierra de Sol Recto, so from Ecuador, and hopes that all of us can one day see her beautiful lands. So then she began to say that the concept of extraction education is incredibly important to her, and as a concept, it isn't talked about a lot in Ecuador, despite the fact that she observes it there on both a national and a local level. This is particularly due to the fact that most of the state budget in Ecuador comes from oil extraction and petrol extraction. So it's really enrooted on all different levels of society. She's now going to go on to give a presentation, especially on how the pandemic has had a backlash on the educational sector in Ecuador, to then talk more in detail on extraction education. Adelante, Katie. Si podría parar después de cada diapositiva, sería perfecto.
Ok, con gusto. Gracias a Joana por la traducción. Entonces, empezábamos con esto del contexto nacional. Y acá hay un dato interesante de este país tan pequeñito que en septiembre del 2020 llegó a ocupar el primer lugar de muertes por el tema del confinamiento, por el tema de la pandemia. Esto ha causado realmente varios impactos sociales y, como vamos a ver más adelante, ha impactado la educación gravemente.
Okay, so Katie's just said that the pandemic has had significant effects on health, education, and labor rights in Ecuador. And as the figures in the diagram show, the pandemic has been a national health catastrophe for her beautiful land. So from March to August of 2020, 32,154 excess deaths were registered in Ecuador. And then, as the diagram on the right-hand side shows, in June, the Financial Times identified Ecuador as the country with the most excess deaths per million globally.
Okay, can you see in the photo, no? Next. Bueno, y entonces aquí tenía esta presentación que en donde les puedo mostrar el nivel de impacto, cómo afectó la pandemia, pero también las políticas del Estado en un recorte muy grande, básicamente de 2.929.000 millones el presupuesto del Estado, lo que significó para la educación un recorte, como ustedes ven, de 831 millones y que más claro podemos ver en el gráfico. Entonces, aquí ustedes pueden ver el presupuesto por año desde el 2016 al 2020 y vemos básicamente cómo tenemos menos 1% en el 2020, menos el 16% de la situación de la educación en mi país.
Okay, so this slide shows the severe impact that the pandemic has had on the rights to education. This year, Ecuador's national budget was cut by $2,929, which meant that of this total cut, 831 million were cut from the national education budget. This can be seen more clearly in the graph on the right-hand side. So you can see that in 2019, it was a minus 1% decrease, and then it went all the way down to minus 16%. Adelante, Kate.
Ok. Y entonces aquí tenemos otro gráfico y aquí hay una cuestión bastante interesante con respecto a la priorización de políticas del Estado. Yo diría una política que además de extractivista es entreguista. ¿Por qué? Porque hay una priorización para pagar la deuda externa en detrimento de la educación. Entonces es el mismo mapa, ¿sí? Pero en relación al pago de la deuda externa, en donde podemos apreciar, ¿no? Que la educación es la que más afectada está. En el 2020, el presupuesto de la educación asciende a menos 16% y el pago de la deuda asciende al 6%.
Okay, so this graph shows the relation between external debt and expenditure in education. So she mentioned that Ecuador was a country whose politics are based on extractivism. So the state pays the external debt in detriment to national education expenditure. So as you can see, while external debt increased by 6% in 2020, expenditure in education decreased by a large 16%. And this has had severe impacts on schools and children in the entire nation.
Correcto. Ahora, digamos, este recorte en el presupuesto tiene manifestaciones concretas. Por ejemplo, algo que se enfrenta, y esto es un dato que lo hemos podido hacer en un proceso colectivo que estamos haciendo desde una organización Shuar acá en la Amazonía que se llama la FENASHP, que es aquí justo esta elaboración dice FENASHP, ya les voy a contar en adelante un poco más de esta organización, pero hemos podido sacar lo siguiente, ¿no? Todo este contexto que relaté antes, ¿no? Algo que ha provocado la deserción escolar. Y esta deserción escolar viene porque la juventud ha tenido que preocuparse por su sobrevivencia, es decir, ha tenido que buscar trabajo en un 22%, también educarse. Si el Estado recorta presupuesto, significa que el mismo estudiante tendrá que contar con comprar básicamente algunos materiales académicos, y es la falta de recursos académicos la que ocupa el 47%. También algo que sucede mucho en las comunidades es un sentido pragmático de la praxis, y entonces educar o la educación va perdiendo su importancia y es más importante ahora cubrir las necesidades diarias, por ejemplo, de alimentación. Es decir, que los jóvenes tienen que ir a cultivar la tierra, a sembrar o a cosechar con sus familias, y eso va quedando a un lado la educación. Y acá, en esta parte que dice no interesado, justamente tiene que ver con un porcentaje, con esta idea que decía antes. El estudiar va teniendo muchas barreras, muchos obstáculos para que la juventud estudie ya desde la secundaria, que entonces es como ahí la mirada del futuro se pierde. Entonces hay que resolver cosas de la hora, y este sentido ocupa el 8%. Perdón.
No problema. Okay, so this table shows the reasons for which youth in Ecuador dropped out of secondary school in 2016. Katie mentioned that the table was created by an indigenous organization from the Pastaza province called FENASHP, which she will elaborate more on in due course. So as the table shows, 22% of students dropped out of school due to the need to work and sustain themselves. Katie mentioned that this has been made more severe due to the cutting of the state budget, because it's meant that many students have had to pay for their own resources, such as textbooks and other learning materials. So this leads on to the next indicator, which states that 47% of youth dropped out due to the lack of economic resources. 12% dropped out due to housework, so having to do other chores outside of school. That meant they couldn't study. And then 8% because they simply weren't interested. Adelante, Katie.
Ok, y aquí quería también saludar, hay una compañera que me acaba de mandar un mensaje que está conectada, que es una investigación que se hizo con la Universidad de Helsinki de Finlandia, y aquí en esta investigación importante que se hizo en 9 unidades educativas interculturales bilingües, ya que es aquí una idea central. En el Ecuador existen 2 sistemas de educación. El uno es la educación formal, ¿no? Y la otra es la del sistema de educación intercultural bilingüe, un nombre largo, pero que responde a un proceso de lucha y organización de los pueblos y nacionalidades indígenas. Y esto se ha materializado en escuelas concretas que son diferentes. Entonces, este estudio lo que hizo es trabajar con estas instituciones que están dentro de este sistema, que es el sistema de la educación intercultural bilingüe. Entonces, miren, de esas 9 instituciones trabajadas en la provincia de Pastaza, resultó que aproximadamente dice, en 2 unidades educativas aproximadamente el 50% no tiene problemas a acceder a la educación virtual. Después tenemos que la mayor parte de estudiantes tienen de alguna manera más posibilidades de conexión, los que están en el último año, que se conoce como el tercero de bachillerato. Ya para graduarse y sacar su título, lograron poner empeño y acceder a la conectividad. Pero esto no sucedió con el resto, es decir, con la gran mayoría de jóvenes y básicamente, y en general de niños, niñas que estudiaban en este sistema de educación. Acá otro dato, para la gran mayoría de estudiantes de bachillerato, su opción han sido las guías de aprendizaje. Es decir, que al no tener internet, al no tener computadoras, ¿sí? Al no poder acceder a estos 2 elementos con los cuales funciona la educación virtual, la única opción ha sido las guías de aprendizaje, que son libros o textos impresos para que puedan estudiar. Acá el otro dato que les decía, que 4 de las 9 unidades educativas estiman que entre el 50 y el 78% de docentes viven en zonas de poca o nula conectividad. Es decir, que no solo los estudiantes que están estudiando en este sistema tienen dificultades, sino también los profesores, los docentes. Bueno, este dato también, ¿no? Los docentes que viven en estas zonas enfrentan un reto particular para responder al Ministerio de Educación. Sí. 2 rectores de 9 acuden a su unidad educativa en busca de conexión. Entonces, hay una serie de dificultades que se evidenciaron en esta pandemia y que Malvika hacía una introducción hablando de esta idea de modernización del Estado, y con esto de la educación, que se dio sobre todo en el gobierno de Rafael Correa, que básicamente aquí podemos concluir que toda esa idea de modernización no llegó a estas unidades educativas.
Okay, so this slide shows the working arrangements in intercultural bilingual schools during the pandemic. At the beginning, Katie defined that there were two school systems in Ecuador. So one is the formal educational system, and the second one is called an intercultural bilingual system. And this refers to a school system in which indigenous communities are fighting against kind of the modernization, fighting against conventional modes of education. However, as these figures in the slide show, the modernization that was imposed in Ecuador during Rafael Correa's government haven't quite reached the school systems and schools that are part of the intercultural bilingual system. So this slide shows data from an investigation that was done in conjunction with a university in Finland in 4 intercultural bilingual schools. So firstly, starting with the top right, it was based on a sample of 4 IB schools. 10 to 20% of students could access virtual education, whereas in a sample of 2 schools, it saw up to 50% of students with internet connection. So you can kind of see varying data sample of students that have or don't have internet connection. Below in the bottom right, the study showed that the majority of students with internet connection were undergoing the bachillerato, so the equivalent of A levels, so they were usually older students. Then at the bottom, it said that due to a lack of internet or computers, textbooks are the only mode of learning for the vast majority of bachillerato students. So, and this makes virtual education incredibly difficult in the intercultural bilingual schools, because most students that are in the final 3 years simply don't have access to internet or computers. Then this being said, it's not only the students that are facing difficulties in face of virtual learning, but also the teachers. So again, based on a sample of 4 intercultural bilingual schools, it was estimated that between 50% to 78% of teachers lived in areas with little or no internet connection. And these teachers face a particular challenge in complying with the educational plans that have been set out for them by the Ministry of Education. And then the very top box shows that 2 in 9 head teachers go to intercultural bilingual schools simply to find internet connection and to have access because they don't at home. Gracias, Katie.
Sí, y una idea más, Joana, en esto. Se mencionó en la introducción con Malvika de las escuelas del milenio. Entonces, las escuelas del milenio lo que querían es centralizar y proporcionar los mejores servicios en un solo lugar, ¿no? Eliminando así a pequeñas escuelas y también colegios. Pues estos datos que están aquí son justamente aquellas que no lograron formar parte de esta idea de cooptación en este modelo de escuelas del milenio y por eso decía, ¿no? Son como las olvidadas, ¿no? A las que todavía no ha podido, no se ha pensado cómo atender sus necesidades y en esta omisión han quedado prácticamente excluidas, ¿no? De esta modalidad que ha sido la modalidad virtual de educación, la predominante en el país por el contexto de la pandemia.
Yeah, so Katie quickly wanted to add that there was, as Marika said in the introduction, there's been a movement in Ecuador to modernize schools, particularly under Rafael Correa. So it was this idea of the schools of the millennium that wanted to centralize and provide the best services in the urban centers, thus eradicating small schools. So she wanted to remind us that the data shown here refers to schools that haven't succeeded in modernizing, and that were essentially excluded, that were the forgotten schools, because they weren't able to keep up with the virtual education model that was brought about due to the pandemic. Katie, solamente tiene algunos minutos.
Sí, gracias. Justo iba a decir eso. Me quedan pocos minutos y entonces este es como el plan educativo del gobierno que no ha funcionado porque hay una idea todavía bastante colonial, pese a que el Ecuador es plurinacional, no ha funcionado, no se piensa la educación de los pueblos y nacionalidades. Y quería finalizar con esto. Pese a todo esto, acá hay un proceso muy interesante, les comparto estas fotos, es la nacionalidad Shuar en Pastaza, que ha hecho un análisis de la situación y en este momento están trabajando para que se pueda decretar la educación en emergencia. Este estudio hasta que fue su cierre el anterior año, prácticamente la juventud, los niños, los adolescentes no estaban teniendo clases por estas limitaciones y esto se ha mantenido hasta ahora. Y una de las peticiones centrales que aquí ustedes pueden leer, bueno, está en español, dicen uno de los carteles, retorno a clases, porque no hay condiciones para, de otra manera, cómo continuar con la educación. Entonces, realmente es una situación difícil, crítica, pero acá están las organizaciones pensando en cómo afrontarla. Y estoy muy gustosa de también poder ser parte de ese proceso y con esa idea y ese mensaje de poder decir que pese a las adversidades, la organización y la lucha, ¿no? Y la organización de, como ustedes ven aquí en la foto, de niños, de padres, de madres, de profesores, es lo que puede dar una salida real a momentos difíciles como estos que enfrentan la educación aquí en los territorios de los pueblos y nacionalidades. Muchas gracias.
Okay, so Katie wants to finish by showing us some pictures of protests and movements that were organized by the Shuar Indigenous community in Pastaza. So what happened when the pandemic hit was that the youth and young children weren't able to access school or classes due to the limitations imposed by the pandemic and the virtual learning environment. And the conditions were too dire to continue education. So communities started organizing to protest as they realized they couldn't go on like this and they needed an alternative. So Katie wants to leave us with one last message, which is that despite adversity, the organization and the fight of children, fathers, mothers, and teachers continues in Ecuador and continues to fight extraction education, and that this is what gives them hope, and that this is what gives people of all nationalities, ages, and vocations hope in Ecuador. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Kátya. Thank you for your presentation. It was incredibly detailed, and I know our audience learned a lot during that presentation, so thank you. So we've got about half an hour left, or 25 minutes rather left. So we're just going to split the rest of the event between questions from myself and questions from you guys. So if you do have any questions, please do add them into the YouTube chat box on your right-hand side of the video. So to start, the first question from myself is just to talk about the impact of these schools on youth, on specifically Indigenous youth. So you've each talked about the different experiences you've had with extraction education, where these corporations own the schools, and the effects that this had on mindsets. But how do you think this has affected young people who've seen it for many years through? And how does it change their attitudes towards extraction? And do you think it affects anti-mining opposition as well? So perhaps to start, if we go to Ruby first.
Yeah. Like I said before, that extraction education rewires or de-indigenizes, but the rewiring happens here also with their value systems. And the incentive to remain in these exploitative learning systems is from the teachers and the admin and whoever. Don't you want to be rich, or you'll be rich? And when they witness someone else's money facilitating their education, just like what Sony Sori pointed out, and which is sold as a liberation from poverty mechanism, of course they are not going to think of anything else or think of their life back home as the one they want. So also you would see that the example of the KISS school that I was giving here too, like the special guests, their imposed role models they meet are all moneyed and influential people. And if you look at their website, they have something called a Lifetime Achievement Award and Humanitarian Awards. You will see that not one in Adivasi has been given that award. And the Humanitarian Award is in its 11th year, I suppose. So the message you get here is your people are not valuable, your systems are not valuable. And on the other hand, money will solve all problems. And that money is going to give you the chance to have a life like us and have the powers that we have. So mainstream education promises a chance at employability, what I was talking about, and where I said that it makes them redundant, both in their society and in mainstream society. And this is where they also tweak their the way they mold these children and their aspirations, aligning them to becoming more like them, or in a more ambitious way saying they become exactly like them, which is really, really scary. So here you see the Adivasi children coming out having an education that can and will place them in companies and organizations that have left many of their ancestors and people displaced. Businesses that their forefathers protested against, resisted, died for, were murdered and jailed for. And this is really a great tragedy. So here we're also trying to look at what people think of the good that comes out of these schools. So here I'm saying is not that Adivasi shouldn't be wealthy or materially or financially rich by mainstream standards, but that this education is not going to tell them the differences between blood money and non-tainted money. And they're not going to, this education is not going to question or make them question where the money they make or the livelihoods they have come from, whether it is an extractive job or nothing or not. So this education is not also allowing them to see the wealth in their traditional life ways. So in that you see that the tools that they acquire are to defend extractivism. And if at all they justify it, it would be about a loss of indigeneity, which is collateral damage, if nothing else. And it's no great loss in the road to emancipation. So in that process, you see these students, these young minds becoming co-conspirators without really meaning to, perhaps, in their own collective annihilation. And that is really, really a greater tragedy than anything else. And I'm not sure if they realize that or how they will ever make their peace with it once they realize what's happening here. Yeah.
Nathan, can we request something?
Yeah.
Sony has to actually travel back because it's quite late here.
Yes.
She came for this for a meeting which was also around uniting different Adivasi organizations. She has to travel back. Can we take the questions first if others don't
Yeah,
mind?
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I'll chuck a few at you then. So do you want to touch on this one first, and then I can ask you another two, and then I'll come back to Katie afterwards.
Okay, thank you. वो जो युवा वर्ग पे क्या
हाँ बोलिए। मतलब मेरा एक आप लोग ने एक सवाल किया है कि युवा वर्ग पर क्या प्रभाव अभी पड़ रहा है, तो मैं इसमें यह कहना चाहती हूँ कि अभी जो शिक्षा जो दिया जा रहा है कंपनियों के तरफ से और सरकार के बीच में, तो युवाओं के लिए बहुत ही बुरा प्रभाव है। मतलब हमारे बस्तर की बात मैं कहूँ तो, क्योंकि वो जो शिक्षा दे रहे हैं तो हम जैसे लोगों को उस स्कूल में दाखिला भी होने नहीं देते हैं, देखने भी नहीं देते हैं वो किस तरह की शिक्षा उनको दिया जा रहा है करे। हम लोग वहां प्रवेश कर ही नहीं सकते। और उनको माता पिता से अलग होने की शिक्षा, अपनी जल जंगल जमीन से अलग होने की शिक्षा। तो और इस तरह से जो जो रिश्ते हैं, जो चीजें हैं हमारे कल्चर से, तो उसका पूरी बेदखल कर रहे हैं ना। तो उसको ये सिखाया जा रहा है कि आप जंगल काटना है, आपको विकास ऐसा होगा, आपको अपने माँ बाप आधा कपड़ा पहनते हैं वैसे नहीं पहनना, आपको इस तरह के कपड़े पहनना है, आपके माता पिता पैदल चलते हैं तो आपको मोटरसाइकिलों में चलना है। तो ये जो शिक्षा है, ये शिक्षा तो हमारी जमीन स्तर की चीजों को पूरा हिला दे रही है। और ये जो माँ बाप पैदल चल रहे हैं तो उन बच्चों को ये शिक्षा दिया जाता है तुम्हारे माँ बाप तो अनपढ़ हैं, कुछ नहीं समझते, गंवार हैं, उनके जैसे नहीं बनना है, आपको गाड़ियों में चढ़ना है, आपको इस मिट्टी के घर में नहीं रहना है, आप जंगल में नहीं रहना है, आपको एक शहर में जैसे बिल्डिंगों के घरों में रहना। मतलब ये है। तो आज हमारे जो बच्चे हैं जो गांव जाना पसंद नहीं कर रहे हैं, अपने माँ बाप के साथ उसके साथ रहना पसंद नहीं कर रहे हैं। अपने जो हम पहाड़ों के लिए लड़ाई करते हैं ना, आंदोलन करते हैं ना, उस समय वो बच्चे लोग कहते हैं नहीं ये तो गलत लड़ाई है, ये लड़ाई ऐसी नहीं लड़नी चाहिए, क्योंकि ये तो पहाड़ों को अगर पूरी काट के यहाँ कंपनी लग जाएगी तो बहुत बढ़िया होगा। इस तरह की जो वो शिक्षा दिया जा रहा है, उस शिक्षा से हमारे जो कल्चर है, हमारे बार बार हम कह रहे हैं वो चीज नहीं दिया जा रहा है। तो हमारे जो कि मतलब हमारी युवा पीढ़ी जो आज शिक्षा ले रही है वो बहुत खतरनाक चीज है। हमको भी डर लगने लग गया है। उसको ऐसी शिक्षा देंगे तो हम जैसे लोगों की कोई कदर नहीं है और कुछ नहीं, हमको ये सोचेंगे कि मतलब ये गलत कर रहे हैं, ये जो लड़ाई करके ये गलत है, इस तरह की चीजें होती है। और नौकरी, यही शिक्षा पाके नौकरी करते हैं, उनके मानवता नहीं रहती है, दया धर्म नहीं रहता है। वो हमारे लोगों को किस तरह से लाचार बना के कंपनियों में, कंपनी मतलब जो माइनिस होती है वहां कैसे कुचला जाता है, फोर्स कैसे मार रही है, कैसे सरकार ने उनके ऊपर इस तरह चला रही है। तो उस समय कोई दया नहीं रहता, कुछ नहीं रहता है, क्योंकि उनको शिक्षा ही ऐसे दिया गया है। वो नहीं है, वो देखते हुए भी साइड से चले जाते। जो नौकरियां करने वाले लोग भी बोलते हैं नहीं मुझे पहले अपनी नौकरी बचानी है, तब हम लोग मतलब आप लोग के बीच में नहीं आएंगे, हमको नौकरी बचाना, हमको बचने दो। ऐसा शिक्षा से हमारा कैसे वंशज बचेगा, आप लोग खुद सोचिए, ये चीज है। और दूसरा सवाल था आदिवासी प्राकृतिक, यही सवाल क्या है अभी? अच्छा,
she shared that the impact on the youth, especially she talks about her experience in Bastar, which is the region she belongs to, that in these corporate extractive education schools, parents do not know what is happening. They have no entry into these schools. There is no way that parents can monitor these schools, and therefore they are disinheriting them, their Adivasi children, from their communities and their futures. And they are teaching them not to be like their parents, so that giving them an education which is exactly the opposite to what their elders, their parents and their ancestors have lived and fought for. So there is a deep stigmatization that is happening, and this stigmatization is pushing the Adivasi children to the cities. And she says now that when they are fighting different extractive industries, the youth are standing in counterpose to their parents, and they are disagreeing to the fight of their parents, and they are saying because we are educated, we actually need these companies, because what have we been educated for? And this, she says, is scaring them deeply. It is scaring them from inside. And the last point, she says that the youth have been dehumanized to such a huge extent through this extractive industry education that it has blinded them to the oppression that their own people, their own elders, their communities are facing in their resistance. And she wonders what kind of an education is this industry giving to their children.
Great. Thank you very much, Soni. I think I'm conscious of the time, and I know you need to hop off now. Yeah, thank you, Soni, again, and we'll pass over to Katie to answer that same question. Dhanyavad, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Muchas gracias por sus preguntas. Bueno, debo decir que para los pueblos y nacionalidades en el Ecuador, la educación ha sido central desde que nacimos como vida organizativa, así como el territorio es algo central, la educación ha sido algo fundamental. Y de esto, la lógica del Estado lo ha visto de manera estratégica como para desmovilizarnos. Es por eso que la educación del milenio para mí es una estrategia de desarticulación de los pueblos y nacionalidades, ya que las escuelas han sido el centro, y son el centro porque es, bueno, desde el inicio, recordemos también que aquí en el Ecuador hacer la escuela para los indígenas, que estaba prohibido, ha sido un ejercicio en primera instancia clandestino. O sea, de manera clandestina hemos tenido que educarnos. Y desde ahí hemos podido pelear nuestro espacio en la sociedad, es decir, nuestra propia educación. Ahora esas fueron formas coloniales. Ahora podemos hablar de formas neocoloniales. Como saben que es un eje central la educación para nuestros pueblos, entonces las empresas extractivas inventan muchas formas, ¿ya? Una es a través del discurso. Tuve una pregunta muy interesante que decía, ¿no? Hay un discurso en donde ofertan como hay una propaganda que a través de esa educación van a tener mejores vidas, cosas, ¿no? Sí, hay un discurso, pero también hay prácticas concretas. O sea, la gente le construyen un aula, le dan las mochilas, le dan los cuadernos, y con eso son formas de cooptación reales y concretas. Entonces, hay discursos y prácticas, pero esos discursos y esas prácticas tienen un límite, ¿ya? Porque los discursos y las ofertas y los cuadernos que dan no alcanzan realmente a cubrir las necesidades de educación y a cubrir lo que realmente la gente espera y cree que merecemos en términos históricos como pueblos y nacionalidades, pero también en términos individuales. ¿Sí? Entonces, por ejemplo, hay otra estrategia son las becas. Ya, las becas son solo para 1 o 2 personas y el resto evidentemente nos miramos en la comunidad unos a otros y vemos que no han cambiado nuestras condiciones. Entonces, esa contradicción entre la teoría, entre el discurso y las prácticas reales tanto de las empresas extractivas como del Estado son un potencial para los pueblos indígenas para continuar en esta lucha por una educación propia, por nuestra propia educación. Ahora mismo, el bloque 10, que está ubicado en Villano, que es un pozo petrolero en donde cooptaron la educación completamente, se han dado cuenta de este límite del discurso y de la práctica. Entonces, ahí está, digamos, cómo se choca con la realidad. Thank you.
Muy bien, gracias, Katie. Okay, so in response to your question, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, so yeah, muchas gracias, Katie. In response to your question, Nathan, Katie has said that in Ecuador, education has been fundamental for the local communities and the state, and that the state has treated education in an incredibly logical way to demobilize Indigenous communities. So Katie sees Millennium Schools as an uprooting mechanism that has been taken advantage of by the state vis-a-vis Indigenous communities. And this has meant that because Indigenous education was something that was kind of banned on a state level, Indigenous communities had to mobilize and create their own ways of educating themselves. She then referred to neocolonial education. So it's this idea that extractive companies are spreading propaganda and are using discourse to promote millennial schools and also to promote extractive education. And they're also pairing this discourse with practical ways and practical mechanisms to try and get people into these extractive educational systems in the millennial schools. So for example, by giving out textbooks and books. But then in reality, Katie said, this also has its limits, as it doesn't even remotely begin to cover the needs and the wants of the local communities. So she says that despite this practical impetus by extractive companies to reel the youth into these schools, Indigenous communities are beginning to be dissatisfied because the textbooks, for example, don't even remotely begin to cover the historical context or the reality of the historical context and complexity of Ecuador. She also referred to scholarships as a strategy that extractive companies are using. However, then she said that because they're only for 1 or 2 people, and the living conditions amongst the Indigenous communities themselves aren't actually changing, they're beginning to realize that nothing has happened and that these companies or these schools aren't actually working out in their favor. So to finish, she said that this contrast between discourse and practice is being increasingly noted by Indigenous communities, and she sees this as an immense potential to allow these communities to keep fighting for their rights, and to actually expose these extractive educational models as something that doesn't serve them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kátya. I've noticed Sony's still got a few more minutes, so what I'm going to do is just ask 1 or 2 questions that I prepared for Sony exclusively, and then if you don't mind, for Ruby and Kátya, we'll move on to audience questions. So just for Sony, before you go, the 2 aspects that I wanted to focus on was 1, Indigenous perspectives on nature, and what you think of what the effect of these mining companies having on Indigenous perspectives on nature. And also, what can the Western world learn from these Indigenous perspectives on the relationship between humans and nature? And the last question is just about, have you got any examples of Indigenous resistance against extraction education? Brilliant.
आदिवासी जो हमारे बस्तर है या पूरे भारत देश के जो आदिवासी हैं, आदिवासी प्रकृति को कैसे देखते हैं, ये बातें होती है हमेशा। पर मैं कहना चाहती हूँ कि आदिवासी प्रकृति को एक इंसान की तरह देखती हैं। ये कि इंसान कैसे होता है, मतलब हमारे प्रकृति के पर किसी भी प्रकार का हमला की स्थिति आए, चाहे वो कंपनी अपनी माइनिश बनाने के लिए उसके पूरे पहाड़ों को, जंगलों को काटने की कोशिश करती है, हमारी प्रकृति की छेड़छाड़ करती है, जैसे एक इंसान को जैसे मारने की कोशिश करते हैं, उसके साथ जैसे हत्या करते हैं, तो उसके लिए जो दर्द होता है वो दर्द हम आदिवासियों को प्रकृति के लिए होता है। और इस तरह से प्रकृति हमारे जीवन है। हम आदिवासी को सबसे बड़ा जीवन का वो है, और वो भले ही बेजान है पर हम उसको एक जान के रूप में महसूस करते हैं। हम आदिवासी प्रकृति को और बहुत प्यार करते हैं, और एक मतलब अपनों से जो प्यार है वो प्यार हमारी प्रकृति से भी हमको उतनी प्यार है, प्रकृति भी हमसे उतना प्यार करती है। तब तो इतनी आंधी तूफान सब में जोपड़ जैसे घर बनाते हैं, उसके बाद भी उन आंधी तूफानों में हमको बचा के रखता है प्रकृति। और दूसरी बात तो यह है कि वो जो रिश्ता है प्रकृति के साथ, हमारा क्या रिश्ता है? अरे हमारे रिश्ता तो प्रकृति के साथ वो रिश्ता जैसे एक माँ का संबंध एक पुत्र से होता है, जो औलादों से होता है, वैसे ही हमारा प्रकृति से एक रिश्ता है। वो हमारी एक पिता माता सब कुछ है हमारे लिए प्रकृति। तब तो जब मतलब आज हमारे बस्तर में प्रकृति को बचाने के लिए और उस पर किसी तरह का जैसे जिंदल है या अडानी है, ऐसे कंपनी आने के वजह से जो चीजों को छेड़छाड़ होने के लिए हजार हमारे आज की स्थिति में इतने लोग अभी तक मर चुके हैं। वो नक्सल के नाम से मार दिया गया हो या फिर किसी ना किसी वजह बना के मार दिया गया। तो प्रकृति के लिए जान देना जानते, जान देंगे, और वो प्रकृति को बिना बचाए ये देश भी नहीं बच सकता। ये आदिवासी को पता है। और आदिवासी को कहा जाता है कि अशिक्षित है, अनपढ़ है, गंवार है। वो नहीं है अनपढ़ गंवार, वो इतनी शिक्षित लोग में से हैं, तब तो इस जंगलों से प्यार करते हैं। वो जंगल से प्यार है तो पूरा देश बचा हुआ ये है। और हम ऐसी कंपनी, ये स्कूल है जो खोले हैं, उनके खिलाफ हम जरूर विरोध करेंगे। इसलिए विरोध करते हैं क्योंकि ये हमारे ऐसी शिक्षा देते हैं, हमारे पहाड़ों से प्यार करने की शिक्षा से बेदखल करते हैं। हमारे हर चीजों, हमारे कल्चर से जो है, हमारे जो आस्था जुड़ी है, उन सारी चीजों से जो मतलब हमारा जो होता है ना, उससे बेदखल करने की शिक्षा देते हैं। तो ऐसे कंपनी के स्कूलों को, ऐसे माइंड, इनकी गुलामी में हम अपने बच्चों को नहीं पढ़ाएंगे और नहीं शिक्षा देंगे, क्योंकि हम लोग इतनी आत्मनिर्भर हैं, हम लोग अपने बच्चों को पढ़ा सकते हैं। ये सब किए मतलब मतलब इस तरह की शिक्षा दे सकते हैं। सबसे ज्यादा ज्ञानदाता अगर शिक्षा देना तो हम आदिवासियों के पास भी है। हम जमीन स्तर को जानते हैं, पेड़ पौधों को जानते हैं, हम हर चीजों को जानते हैं। हमने कभी नफरत करना भी नहीं सीखा था। आज आदिवासी और गैर आदिवासी में फर्क है। आदिवासी कभी किसी से नफरत नहीं करते, लेकिन गैर आदिवासी जरूर नफरत करते हैं। वो अपनी देवी देवता को लाके बोलते ये हमारा देवी तुम मानो, लेकिन आम आदिवासी ये नहीं कहते हमारी देवी को तुम मानो। ये कभी होता ही नहीं है। तो इस तरह से ना तो बेटी बेटी पैदा होने से उसमें भी कोई भेदभाव नहीं होता, और उसमें चाहे लड़का हो चाहे लड़की हो, वो पैदा इसमें भी भेदभाव नहीं। तो ये कितनी अच्छी शिक्षा है आदिवासियों के लिए। सोच लीजिए, जो पढ़ता है वो करता। जब हमारी महिलाओं के साथ दिन दाड़ इतनी अत्याचार हो रहा है, बलात्कार हो रहा है, फोर्स के द्वारा बलात्कार किया जा रहा है, तो उसमें भी कोई भेदभाव नहीं करते। अगर वही चीज और गैर आदिवासियों में देखा जाओगे तो किसी महिला को किसी इसका बलात्कार होता है तो उसको सामाजिक बहिष्कार होता है, लेकिन हमारे में बहिष्कार नहीं किया जाता। उसका सम्मान करते हैं, उसको अपनाते हैं, और एक तो सोचते हैं कि इनके साथ ये स्थिति हुआ तो इसको अगर हम इनको साथ नहीं देंगे तो कौन देंगे। इस तरह की चीजें की हम आदिवासियों के अंदर में इस तरह की शिक्षा है। तो इसलिए हम जो भी शिक्षा हमारे बच्चों को, हमारे लोगों को देने से हम कंपनियों की गुलामी की शिक्षा नहीं चाहिए। हमको अपनी शिक्षा, अपनी स्वतंत्रता और हमारे जंगलों से जुड़ा हुआ हर तरह की एक देश, बोलते हैं ना देश आजाद है, तो देश आजाद है तो हमारी शिक्षा भी आजाद ही होना चाहिए। आजाद की शिक्षा देनी चाहिए, ना कि गुलामी की नहीं। जब देश गुलाम हुआ तो शिक्षा में हम गुलामी क्यों करें? सवाल मेरा ये है। तो हम सबसे सही बात आप लोग ने कहा है कि हम सबको मिलकर लड़ना चाहिए। आम आदिवासियों के, आम आदिवासियों का जो पहना ओढ़ा तक का फर्क किया जाता है कि आप ऐसे मत पहनो, हमारा वही सही पहचान है। हम आधे कपड़े में पहनते हैं पर हम जानते हैं जिंदगी जीना, जिंदगी देना, और लोगों को किस तरह से हम लोग मोहब्बत करते हैं। और प्रकृति तो हमारा जान और हमारी माँ सब कुछ है, धरती, और जिससे हमको कोई बेदखल नहीं कर सकता। और वो हमारे अंदर में, हम आदिवासी के अंदर में ये शिक्षा है, और उस शिक्षा को हम अपने स्तर पे देना चाहेंगे। बस मैं इतना कहना चाहती हूँ। और मुझे इस जगह पे बहुत अच्छा लगा, और मैं आप लोगों को सबको, साथियों को जवाब, और मैं तहे दिल से आप लोग को धन्यवाद करती हूँ। और बस हम आप लोग, मतलब इस तरह की फाइट है, ये भी एक लड़ाई का मैदान है। आप लोग लड़िए, हम आपके साथ हैं, और हम मिल के करेंगे, और अच्छी शिक्षा ला के रहेंगे, हक अधिकार से लड़ने की शिक्षा, और वो हम कभी किसी के सामने नहीं झुकेंगे। बस इतना कहते हैं।
Wow, I'm just so overwhelmed. So she says that to Nathan's two questions, that nature, the Adivasi people see nature as a living being. It's part of their life. And so any attack on nature gives us the same pain as any one of our near and dear person is attacked. So, and she says, if you love nature, then nature loves you back. And that's the reason why the Adivasi people, despite facing so much of the ravages of storms and different destructions, nature has continued to protect them. And therefore she is mother to them. And because today Adani, Jindal, SR, NMDC and Vedanta kind of companies are attacking nature, therefore they are today standing up and organizing themselves to protect this nature. So their fight, she says, the fight to protect nature is not just a fight for their own survival, but if nature is protected, then this country is protected. And so they are actually fighting to save this country. It's not just about their fight to save themselves. And she says that therefore we will never send our children to schools which are run by these kind of companies, which are run on this kind of extractive education principles. And she says our people are intelligent enough, wise enough, have all the knowledge and the capacities to run their own education system. She says we can educate our own children. We do not need you, the non-Adivasi people, to educate our children, and we can educate them in our way, because we teach with love. We teach love, and we never teach hate. But it is the non-Indigenous community whose education is based on ideas of discrimination, hierarchy, hate, violence, and exclusion. But it's the Adivasi education which is inclusive in every way. And therefore, she says, we do not want this company-sponsored education. And she says that if today we have fought for our independence, and we feel that our country is independent, then the education that the Adivasi wants also should be independent. We should, and that would mean true freedom when we can educate our children in an independent atmosphere, in an independent system where the control of that education is with us. And therefore, that education that we will give to our children will help us liberate our community from all the injustice that is that they are facing, and will be able to experience true freedom. And she thanks everyone, and she enjoyed this session, and was sorry that we have to she has to leave early. And thank you everyone. And she says, this is a fight. It is a collective fight. It's not just a fight to save our land, but it's a fight to give our children the education that we want them to give, the right kind of education, which will help them, enable them to fight for their rights and justice. And she is with us in this fight. So she says, you carry on the fight, and whenever you need me, I am there to stand by you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharanya and Soni. That was incredibly touching, that answer. So thank you, and also thank you for joining. Brilliant. So I'm aware we're slightly over time now. So what I'll do is I'll combine a few of the audience questions and then direct them to Ruby and then Kátya. Yeah. So to start for Ruby, Indigenous knowledge needs to be disseminated among non-Indigenous peoples as well. What do you think might be an acceptable and just model of incorporating Indigenous knowledge into education? And the second question for you, Ruby, would be, the world is increasingly looking at Indigenous ecosystems during the pandemic as opposed to extractive practice. How can Adivasis contribute to this growing knowledge sphere? So very similar questions. And then for Kátya, I don't know, Jojo, if you want to translate in advance, a message, Katie. Can you please reflect on the extractive education for Indigenous peoples, and how can global solidarity be forged that address some common challenges faced? And the second question was just to ask Kátya a little bit more about the Millennium Schools and what she thinks about them. So if we start with Ruby.
Nathan,
Yep, Ruby, sorry. Oh, sorry, Ruby, you're on mute.
Sorry, Katie was also speaking. I'm sorry, who goes first?
Ruby, if you want to start, and then Katie will come to you afterwards, yeah?
Okay. I think I lost your second question, but I'll ask you after.
It's very similar, just about how the rest of the world can learn from these Indigenous knowledge spheres. Yeah.
Right. So like I mentioned, we are, even with assimilation's not the word, but incorporating Adivasi systems and knowledge systems in the mainstream, it's again an uphill task, because we are in systems that have already been what is the word? That have already established their ways of being, So when you look at subjects like anthropology, sociology, and all of that, I mean, you're talking about 200 plus years of discourses, and suddenly Indigenous peoples come 200 years later and they say, everything you've been saying about us is incorrect, and this is how things should be done. It's not going to be easy. So how do we find that balance? So number one, that would be the issue of finding that fine balance of incorporating and involving Indigenous systems. But then Indigenous elders, the people, our knowledge keepers, are not ones who would be easily accepted in university spaces or educational systems, because again, this is a mainstream system where you need to have certain qualifications, you need to have certain degrees. If you don't, you are not authentic, you're not eligible, and that becomes a problem. So there has to be, again, I think, a decolonization of the education systems, and the mainstreams actually allowing us that space, letting us to be ourselves and accepting our knowledge systems. But if you look at the way our knowledge systems are treated, it is not only just looked at with disdain, but also as something of a lower culture. And how do you change that mindset when you look at people, Indigenous cultures, and their worldviews, which are steeped in folklore, in songs, in things that are so alien to the mainstream society, where they also look at it as mystical and sometimes maybe stupid. So how then are they going to accept that kind of a knowledge system? And then when you look at the academic circles, where every paper or research paper you write, you ask for references. How are Indigenous people supposed to reference their knowledges that have come down to us from orality? And we find a way to know that this is authentic because we say it's authentic. And even when in that narration, the forms change, because that is the nature of orality, we accept that as authentic, that there could be several versions and all of that. But every time we are going to be addressing mainstream educational society or spaces, we are going to be looked at as people who are not really erudite, who haven't really gone through the processes. So this is not really our task alone. This is the task of mainstream society, mainstream educational systems. So you have to find a way to see how you incorporate our knowledge systems as equal to yours, and how you would like to really learn from us or not. And in fact, it is really impossible in many ways for Indigenous peoples with their current system to share space unless it is something that is a special, you know? So it's not what you will be marked upon, and it's not something that will have credit, but something that is additional knowledge, that is an additional special, what would I say, appearance of sorts, you know? So there's always this imbalance in which ways our knowledge systems are pitted against the mainstream. So I don't see an easy way out. I don't know what the answers are really. I just know they're different and not really balanced. Yeah.
That's a really important distinction there. And it informs a lot of the global solidarity work, because a lot of people are, like you said, are confused of how to do it in a just way, and what they don't realize is that process in itself is problematic and colonial. Brilliant. So Katie, so those two questions that I posed to you. Thank you, Ruby.
Ok. Bueno, quería empezar con una idea que se me quedó antes en esta contradicción entre el discurso y las prácticas que ofrecen tanto el Estado y las empresas con la realidad. Entonces, básicamente es cuando hay contaminación, que eso siempre va a haber por parte de empresas extractivas, y tienes contaminada la tierra, el río, entonces ya la olita, el cuadernito que te dan, que te ofrecen, no es suficiente. Entonces ahí hay un fuerte choque, es ineludible. Cuando miras cómo se llevan, y en países como el Ecuador hay tanta corrupción y se llevan tanto dinero que sale de la explotación petrolera, y miras que tus condiciones económicas no han cambiado, entonces eso produce realmente una gran indignación, nos indigna ver esto, ¿ya? Y entonces eso nos permite movilizarnos. Cuando miras que, por ejemplo, hay ofertas en donde dice, no, tranquilos, vamos a contaminar solo 20 hectáreas, pero miras que fue más, realmente es más, y que no pueden controlar la naturaleza. Entonces, ahí es cuando nos da indignación, porque vemos que no es verdad, que es mentira. Y esto es importante, ¿no? Y después he recibido una pregunta muy interesante. Yo creo que hay que entender lo siguiente en la educación, y es que hay un sistema de educación dominante, ¿ya? Que nosotros hemos visto mucha alianza entre el Estado y las empresas extractivas que les facilitan muchas cosas. Y en esto vemos que la educación o escuelas como, no solo las escuelas del milenio, sino también el resto de la educación formal, priorizan este sistema dominante de hacer educación. Y cuando decimos dominante, básicamente es como alguien está arriba y otros están abajo, y resulta que nosotros somos los que estamos abajo. Y por ejemplo, en el idioma, para mí es muy importante estudiar el inglés. Claro, ahora mismo no tendría que hacerle trabajar tanto a Joana, ¿ya? Pero y hay que hacerlo y debemos saber el inglés. Es una lengua global, por supuesto, pero esa lengua global no puede estar por encima de otras lenguas. Eso es un atentado contra la diversidad. Eso significa que estamos caminando hacia un mundo homogenizante, en donde no hay diversidad. Y eso es atentar contra la propia humanidad. Entonces no podemos educar a las personas dentro de una lógica homogenizadora, sino debemos educarla dentro de la diversidad que se supone que somos los seres humanos, o mejor dicho, que somos realmente, pero que parece que nos educan para ser así como la producción de los jeans, todos iguales, todo el jean blue y de y eso no somos las personas. Entonces, pelear por la educación propia, por una educación diferente, es pelear por una diversidad, por la diversidad humana, por el respeto a lo diverso, ¿ya? Por no construir relaciones de dominación, sino relaciones de armonía, relaciones de entendimiento mutuo, solidarias. La pregunta era que reflexione sobre cómo hacer una sociedad o solidaridad global. Lo global tiene que respetar lo diverso, lo particular. No va a haber realmente una solidaridad global si no hay un respeto hacia lo particular, a las diversidades. No importa, no se trata de cantidad, o sea, no se trata de que somos el 3% en el Ecuador o de que somos una minoría. Se trata de que somos seres humanos y que si no nos asumimos diversos, entonces somos, ¿qué? Somos máquinas homogéneas, piezas, todos iguales. Entonces, eso es contra natura, ¿ya? Una educación así es contra natura. Entonces, es importante el inglés, por supuesto, pero es importante que nosotros, o tiene relación, cogiendo este ejemplo del inglés, si es que hay otras lenguas que están ahí, si no solo es el inglés, sino es eso y también esta otra diversidad, y así con todo, con la justicia, con los sistemas económicos, con la salud. ¿Sí? Hay una diversidad y eso nos hace ricos realmente como humanidad. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, so in response to your question, Nathan, about Millennium schools and what she thinks of them in general. So she kind of harked back to a point that she made earlier on about the contradiction between the discourse and the practice of the state and extractive companies. So she gave the example that it may all be fair and good that schools provide Indigenous communities with textbooks and scholarships in order to reel them into the formal education system. When there's pollution and when a river or an area around these Indigenous communities is still polluted, then all of these practical material items that extractive companies or the state are giving them become worthless. So she says that when you see that the socioeconomic structures and the structure of colonial power hasn't actually changed in Ecuador or for the Indigenous communities, then people begin to doubt these formal education systems. So in response to the other question, where you asked her to reflect on extractive education for Indigenous people and how global solidarity can be forged, Katie gave an incredibly powerful answer here. So she said that, there's one dominant education system that the state and extractive companies are collaborating on to uphold. And this doesn't only refer to the so-called millennium schools, but also the schools that form part of the formal education system in Ecuador. So all of the ones that don't form part of the intercultural bilingual system. And she says that by proxy within this formal education system, there's there's a hierarchy that's created, and there's a power hierarchy whereby people will always be at the top and Indigenous communities will predominantly be on the bottom. And she then referred to language, and which I thought was incredibly interesting. So she referred to English and language, and she says that this is almost an attack against diversity, because although English is, obviously English is a sign of the increasingly globalized world that is homogenizing cultures and homogenizing languages. And she says that we can't educate people within a homogenizing logic, but that we must educate them in a diversifying logic that sees us and our languages and our cultures and our systems as diverse humans, and as the diverse, structures in which we live in. So she says that to fight for a different education is to fight for diversity, and is to fight against colonial power structures, to fight for mutual understanding and for solidarity and for justice. And she also said that it's not about quantity, it's not about seeing some populations as minority communities or minority populations or others. She said that we're all human beings in this interconnected world, and they don't see themselves as minority populations. So whose right is it to attribute this label to them? So she said, what are we? We're all equal, and we need an education system that sees us all as equal, and that this is the most natural thing for us. And again, she referred back to English and this argument in favor of diversity. And she also then mentioned that, it's the same for economic structures or social structures. There's such a diverse range, and that we cannot give in to one homogenized system because we simply, we aren't all equal. Yeah. So.
Brilliant. Thank you. So I'll just wrap up now. Each of you are given, and I know Sonia's not on the call, but I'll pass this back to her. Each given really, really powerful responses, and I know I've been moved very much by them. And if you look at the what people have been saying in the YouTube live stream as well, they've also been moved as well. And there's also a great desire for this global solidarity, as you can see from the questions, to support, as Sonia mentioned towards the end of her last answer, where she said, this is a fight that concerns all of us. There's definitely a global desire to tackle them, even though we may be separated by languages and geographies. There's this burning desire to sort of fight these injustices. So thank you to each of you. And Kátya, muchas gracias por atender y participar. Su presencia fue muy importante para nosotros. La presentación fue súper interesante. Muchas gracias. So just to end, I'm going to mention just some of the upcoming things from OCS and ISIS magazine. So firstly, for ISIS, there's an important event tomorrow of poetry at 8 p.m. featuring award-winning poets Andrew Macmillan, Will Harris, Romelin Ante, and more. Tickets via Fixer are still available, and that's at 8 p.m. tomorrow. And then to mention one of the big, our flagship event for OCS is happening on Monday, which we're very excited for, led by Shobhan, the Vice President. So we're actually hosting Noam Chomsky, who Malvika referenced in her introduction. He'll be speaking on neoliberalism, democracy, and the climate crisis. He's also known as the father of modern linguistics. He's a philosopher, cognitive scientist, historian, and political activist. He'll be discussing the compatibility of our current political and economic institutions with climate action and the role of public mobilization and government policy in tackling the climate crisis. I'd also like to thank Jojo for translating and articulating Kátya to our English-speaking audience, and also to Malvika to help for helping to co-organize and contact each of our speakers. So yeah, been a lovely event and lovely to connect with each of you. If all the speakers just hold on for a minute, and we'll end the live stream there.